We can barely speak about how the Dark Empire has claimed Africa without putting some focus onto one of the most obvious agents of the Dark Agenda aimed at globalization and centralization of power under the banner of British imperialism, namely Cecil John Rhodes. Rhodes was born on the 5th of July 1853 in Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire, England. He was the fifth son of Reverend Francis William Rhodes and his wife Louisa Peacock Rhodes. His siblings included Francis William Rhodes, who became an army officer. His father was a Church of England vicar, which is the first indication of who the Rhodes family really served. Although the Church of England is known to be Anglican, it started off as Roman Catholic, and today forms part of and is controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. At this time, British imperialism and colonization was high on the agenda of the Anglican Church, who sent many missionaries to South Africa to convert what they refer to as the godless natives to Christianity. And thus, as an adolescent, a sickly asthmatic Cecil John Rhodes was taken out of grammar school and sent to Natal, South Africa, because his family thought the hot climate would improve his health. On the 1st of September 1870, Cecil John Rhodes first set foot on African soil. As the land in Natal was unsuited to growing cotton, he only remained in Natal until October 1871, when he moved to the diamond fields just opening up in Kimberley. Financed by Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Son, over the next 17 years, Rhodes succeeded in buying up all the smaller diamond mining operations in the Kimberley area. He started De Beers in 1880 and founded Goldfields of South Africa Limited in 1887. His monopoly of the world's diamond supply was sealed in 1889 through a strategic partnership with the London-based Diamond Syndicate. They agreed to control the world's diamond supply to maintain high prices. To this very day, they burn diamonds in Kimberley if there are too many found, as it will lower the price of diamonds. In fact, artificial scarcity of diamonds are maintained in order to keep their prices high. The agreement soon proved to be very successful. For example, during the trade slump of 1891 to 1892, supply was simply curtailed to maintain high prices. Among Rhodes's associates in the early days were John X. Merriman and Charles Rudd, who later became his partner in De Beers Mining Company and Niger Oil Company. During the 1880s, the vineyards in Cape Town had been devastated by a phylorexia epidemic. The diseased vineyards were dug up and replanted, and the farmers were looking for alternatives to wine. In 1892, Rhodes financed the Pioneer Fruit Growing Company in Noordgedacht, and by 1896, he was beginning to pay more attention to fruit farming. A year later, Rhodes bought Roan and Boschendal and commissioned Sir Herbert Baker to build him a cottage there. The influence of the educational aspect of Rhodes is very important to understand, both in terms of how it molded him and in terms of the educational legacy left behind. In 1873, Rhodes left his farm fields and diamond mines in the care of his business partner, Rudd, and sailed for England to complete his studies. He was admitted to Oriel College at Oxford, but stayed for only one term in 1873. He returned to South Africa and did not return for his second term until 1876, and finally graduated in 1881. Rhodes was extremely attached to the imperialist ideals of Britain and the conquest of the world in the name of Great Britain. At this point in time, control of the world was being accomplished through Great British imperial and naval might. In present-day politics, the Vatican uses the United States and its military might to conquer countries that it wants to rob of its wealth and resources. It is the same old dark agenda, and the evidence that Rhodes became a knowing co-conspirator of the dark agenda became obvious when one looks at the facts about him which have been documented. Whilst attending Oriel College, Rhodes became a Freemason in the Apollo University Lodge and remained a Freemason until his death in 1902. Now remember, the Jesuits control international Freemasonry. In Rhodes's opinion, he did not see the Freemasons as an adequate and effective secret society, and this later caused him to envisage his own secret society with the goals of bringing the empire under British rule. In fact, after returning from his time at Oriel College, Rhodes wrote his first will in 1877, in which Rhodes wanted to create a secret society that would bring on the whole world under British rule. The exact wording from his will in 1877 is as follows: "To and for the establishment, promotion and development of a secret society, the true aim and object whereof shall be the extension of British rule throughout the whole world, the perfecting system of immigration from the United Kingdom and of colonization by British subjects of all lands where the means of livelihood are attainable by energy, labour and enterprise, and especially the occupation by British settlers of the entire continent of Africa, the Holy Land, the Valley of the Euphrates, the islands of Cyprus and Candia, the whole of South America, the islands of the Pacific not heretofore possessed by Great Britain, the whole of the Malay Archipelago, the seaboard of China and Japan, the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire, the inauguration of a system of colonial representation in the Imperial Parliament which may tend to wield together the disjointed members of the Empire, and finally, foundation of so great a power as to render wars impossible and promote the best interests of humanity." It was obvious from his first will, which was rewritten, that during his time at Oxford University, that Rhodes had been initiated into the global secret society network that was controlled by the Vatican. The Vatican connection is further established when you look at the degree that Rhodes studied at Oxford, the Doctor of Civil Law. It is a very exclusive degree and only offered by very few universities, such as the University of Oxford. At Oxford, the degree of the Doctor of Civil Law is customarily conferred on foreign heads of state as well as the Chancellor of the University. Although the total sum of Cecil John Rhodes' time at Oxford University was barely 2 full years, it had a tremendous influence on him, as he had been initiated into the global secret society network through the Freemasons, and as a result, he was inspired to develop his scholarship schemes in accordance with these ideas through closed secret society networks, of which Rhodes scholars are usually members. In his last will and testament, he provided for the establishment of the famous Rhodes Scholarships, which was the world's first international study program. The scholarships enabled students from territories under British rule, from America, from Germany, and from other places further afield, to study at the University of Oxford. Much like many other secret societies connected to universities, initiates are funneled into positions of power and influence. Bill Clinton is a former Rhodes Scholar. Whilst at Oxford, Rhodes continued to prosper in Kimberley. Before his departure for Oxford, he and Charles Rudd had moved from the Kimberley mines to invest in the more costly claims of what is known as the Old De Beer Mines. It was named after Johannes Nicolaas de Beer and his brother, Diederik Arnoldus, who occupied the farm. In 1874 and 75, the diamond fields were in the grip of a depression. Whilst Rhodes went to and from between South Africa and Oxford University, Rudd ran the business. On the 12th of March 1880, Rhodes launched the De Beers Mining Company after the amalgamation of a number of different claims, and De Beers became the sole owner of all diamond mining operations in the country. In 1880 was also the year Rhodes prepared to enter into public life in the Cape. In 1890, Rhodes became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and implemented laws that would benefit the mines and the industry owners. He introduced the Glen Grey Act in 1894. This act also effectively pushed black people from their lands in order to make way for industrial development. Through this act, he introduced a hut tax by abolishing traditional communal tenure enjoyed by tribes and established a system of individual rather than a communal tenure. Each hut had to pay a tax, and thus, Xhosa men were forced to seek employment on commercial farms or in industry and mining. According to Dr. Credo Mutwa, the South African people largely ignored the mining operations that they soon saw were taking place in their country. Our people were happy to stay in their villages, but new laws were instituted by the colonial government of Natal, especially where all able-bodied men were forced to go on a long-distance journey by foot to work for starvation wages in the diamond fields of Kimberley. Many stories are told of brave black men and women who went to Kimberley to work in the town of Kimberley, amongst all kinds of disease and corruption, in the Great Hole of Kimberley, a site which had previously been a hill which was a sacred place to our people. Rhodes did a lot to destabilize family life in South Africa and Zimbabwe. He forced all the chiefs of the tribes that they had to pay him taxes for being on his land, and so the chiefs had to send people from the tribes to work in the mines to make money for the chiefs to pay tax, which was now demanded of our people, to be paid not in cattle, as had been the case before, but in gold sovereigns. Rhodes told the people that if they did not do it, he was going to call the soldiers from England. A young Zulu had to leave his father's home and go on foot over the Drakensberg mountains, walk great distances, which took about a week, and there he was to find work for 1 gold sovereign a year. This 1 gold sovereign would then be turned over to the local chiefs, who would in turn turn it over to the colonial authorities as tax. Rhodes' policies were exactly that of British imperialism, which was being used to conquer the world and keep the resources under the control of the Vatican and the governments that they control, such as the British Empire. However, Rhodes did not have direct political power over the Boer republics of the Transvaal. He often disagreed with the Transvaal government's policies. He believed that he could use his money and power to overthrow the Boer government and install a British colonial government supporting mine owners' interests in its place. In fact, in 1895, Rhodes supported and financed an attack on the Transvaal, the infamous Chamberlain raid, which proceeded with tacit approval of the Secretary of State for the colonies, Joseph Chamberlain. The raid was a catastrophic failure. It forced Cecil John Rhodes to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and his oldest brother, Colonel Frank Rhodes, was sent to jail in the Transvaal and convicted of treason and nearly sentenced to death. The Chamberlain raid indirectly led to the outbreak of both the Second Matabele War as well as the Second Boer War. Rhodes used his wealth and that of his business partner Alfred Bate, a Jewish German that had become one of the landlords, and other investors to pursue his dreams of creating a British Empire in the new territories to the north. Rhodes's competitive advantage over other mineral prospecting companies was due to a combination of his wealth and astute political instincts, also referred to as the imperial factor. This was due to the way Rhodes used the British government by befriending its local representatives, the British Commissioners, and through them organized British protectorates over the mineral concessions of the area via separate but related treaties. In this way, he obtained both security and legality for mining operations. He could then win over more investors. Imperial expansion and capital investment went hand in hand. Rhodes promoted his business interests as the strategic interests of Britain, preventing the Portuguese, the German, or the Boers from moving into central South Africa. Rhodes's companies and agents cemented these advantages by obtaining mining concessions, as exemplified by the Rudd and Lochner concessions. Rhodes had already tried and failed to get mining concessions from Lobengule, king of the Ndebele of Matabeleland. In 1888, he tried again. He sent John Moffat, son of missionary Robert Moffat, who was trusted by the Lobengule, to persuade the latter to sign a treaty of friendship with Britain, and to look favorably on Rhodes and his proposals. First, the missionaries gained the trust of the tribal leaders by converting them to their beliefs, and then becoming their spiritual leaders, so that they trust the advice of the missionaries as the very will of God. This is one of the best examples in mainstream history of just how corporate Christianity has been used to conquer the world and create wealth. Rhodes's agent Francis Thompson, who had travelled to Bulawayo in the company of Rhodes's business partner Charles Rudd and Rochford Maguire, assured Lobengula that no more than 10 white men would mine Matabele land. This limitation was left out of the document which Lobengula signed, known as the Rudd Concession. Furthermore, it stated that the mining company could do anything necessary to their operations. When Lobengula later discovered the true effect of the concession, he tried to renounce it, but the British government ignored him. Armed with the Rudd Concession, in 1889, Rhodes obtained a charter from the British government for his British South African Company to rule, police, and make new treaties with concessions from the Limpopo River to the Great Lakes of Central Africa. He obtained further concessions and treaties north of the Zambezi, such as those in Barotseland, which was known as the Lochner Concessions with King Lewanika in 1890. This was orchestrated in a similar manner to the Rudd Concession, where the king had no idea of what he was actually agreeing to, as what happened is totally different as to what was promised. Rhodes wanted the Bechuanaland Protectorate, now known as Botswana, under the British South African Company Charter. But the three Tswana kings, including Khama III, travelled to Britain and won over British public opinion, for it remained governed by the British Colonial Office in London. The British South Africa Company had its own police force, the British South African Police, which used to control Matabeleland and Mashonaland, and, in present-day Zimbabwe. The company hoped to start a new Rand from the ancient gold mines of the Shona. Because the gold deposits were on a much smaller scale, many of the white settlers who accompanied the British South Africa Company to Mashonaland became farmers rather than miners. When the Ndebele and Shona, the two main rival people, separately and independently rebelled against the European settlers, the British South Africa Company defeated them in the two Matabele Wars from 1893 to 1894, and then again in 1896 to 1897. Shortly after learning of the assassination of the Ndebele spiritual leader Malimo by the American scout Frederick Russell Burnham, Rhodes walked unarmed into the Ndebele stronghold in the Matabo Hills and persuaded the Impi to lay down their weapons, thus ending the Second Matabele War. By the end of 1894, the territories over which the South African British Company had concessions or treaties were collectively called Zambezia, after the Zambezi River flowing through the middle. In May 1895, it was officially changed to Rhodesia, reflecting Rhodes's popularity amongst the settlers who had been using the name informally since 1891. Rhodes never married, famously stating, "I have too much work on my hands and would not be a dutiful husband." Some academics and writers have suggested that Rhodes was most likely homosexual. Someone of great importance in Rhodes's life was Neville Pickering, whom he had hired in 1881 as the secretary of the De Beers Mining Company. The two developed what Graham Bauer, an imperial secretary in the Cape, described as an absolute lover-like friendship. Rhodes and Pickering lived together for 4 years, beginning in 1882. In October that year, Rhodes revised his will on Pickering's 25th birthday, leaving his entire estate to Pickering. 2 years later, Pickering developed an infection after he suffered a riding accident. Rhodes was at one of his goldfields when the news reached him that Pickering was close to death. Unable to get a seat on a coach, Rhodes made the 15-hour, 300-mile journey home, riding on mailbags on the top of a vehicle. Completely indifferent to pressing business matters, Rhodes remained steadfastly at Pickering's side for several weeks until his beloved friend died in his arms. Those in attendance at Pickering's funeral were shocked by the normally staid Rhodes's unrestrained display of grief. Rhodes was said to have wept with fervour. From that day forward, Rhodes never again set foot in the house that he and Pickering had happily shared. Rhodes later shared similar friendships with other younger men. Among these was Pickering's successor, Henry Latham Curry, the son of an old friend who had become Rhodes's private secretary in 1884, except when Curry got engaged in 1894, Rhodes was deeply mortified and their relationship split. Rhodes also developed a very close friendship with Curry's successor, Philip Jourdan. Rhodes remained close to Dr. Leander Starr Jamison after the two had met in Kimberley, where they had shared a bungalow. In 1896, Earl Grey came to give Rhodes bad news. Rhodes instantly jumped to the conclusion that Jamison, who was ill at the time, had died. On learning that his house had burnt down, Rhodes commented, "Thank goodness, if Dr. Jim had died, I should never have got over it." Jamison nursed Rhodes during his final illness and was a trustee of his estate and a residuary of his will, which allowed him to continue living in the Rhodes mansion after his death. Rhodes' secretary Jourdan, who was present at Rhodes' death, said of Jamison, "Jamison was fighting against his own grief. No mother could have displayed more tenderness towards the remains of a loved son." Dr. Jamison died in England in 1917, but after the war in 1920, his body was transferred to a grave besides that of Rhodes in the Mutwa National Park, 40 kilometers south of Bulawayo. Cecil John Rhodes' contemporaries noted that he favored the company of young men. When Rhodes came out to his mother and wondered how his late father would have reacted, her reply was simply, "Your father knew Cecil Rhodes." Although Rhodes remained a leading figure in the politics of Southern Africa, especially during the Second Freedom War, also known as the Second Anglo-Boer War, he was dogged by ill health throughout his relatively short 48 years of life. He was initially sent to Natal in South Africa because it was believed the climate might help the problems with his heart. On returning to England in 1872, his health again deteriorated with heart and lung problems, to the extent that his doctors believed he would only survive a further 6 months. He returned to Kimberley, where his health improved. From the age of 40, his heart condition returned with increasing severity until his death from heart failure in 1902 at a seaside cottage in Muizenberg. The government arranged an epic journey by train from the Cape to Rhodesia, with the funeral train stopping at every station to allow mourners to pay their respects. He was finally laid to rest at World's View, a hilltop located approximately 35 kilometers south of Bulawayo in what was then Rhodesia. Today, his grave forms part of what is the Mutwa National Park in Zimbabwe. Dr. Credo Mutwa's comments on these events were as follows. Cecil John Rhodes had himself buried at the Mutwa Mountains, which is one of the places on earth where the Chitauri are seen and heard. Cecil John Rhodes had himself buried above the grave of a much older leader and a far greater man than himself. I am told that a remote ancestor of mine is buried there, and Rhodes ordered that he be buried on higher ground, so as to show the native people that he was superior to all their kings and leaders. At Rhodes's funeral, it was requested by tribal elders that no weapons be fired, as it would disturb the spirits. It is still a mystery to most as to why Cecil John Rhodes would have chosen to be buried there, but if you take into account Dr. Credo Mutwa's accounts of the Chitauri, or the reptilian beings who live in these hills, it makes perfect sense for Rhodes to have chosen to be buried there. If we are to take into consideration that these reptilian beings are using the human race as a slave species, all orchestrated through the Vatican. Indeed, Cecil John Rhodes was a secret society initiate who was instrumental in creating and controlling educational institutions that would shape the minds of those needed to assist in fulfilling the Dark Empire's dark agenda. It was, after all, the Rothschilds' bank, N.M. Rothschild and Son, that funded Cecil John Rhodes in the development of the British South African Company. Leopold de Rothschild administered Rhodes' estate upon his death in 1902 and helped set up the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme at Oxford University. Rhodes' will also donated land beneath the Rhodes Memorial to the establishment of further campuses for the University of Cape Town. Rhodes' University in Grahamstown was established in his name by his trustee and founded by an Act of Parliament on the 31st of May 1904. It is also important to note that Rhodes University had a close connection with Fort Hare University, which spawned a generation of African politicians. Rhodes University publicly cut ties with Fort Hare University after the enforcement of racial segregation through the apartheid regime, which started in 1948. However, despite publicly appearing to be apart, Rhodes University has always maintained a covert connection to Fort Hari through the fraternal network of South African secret societies, such as the Freemasons and even various religious groups. The connection between Fort Hari University and Rhodes University has remained intact as a result. In fact, it is difficult to see where the boundaries between the universities are drawn, as in 2004, Fort Hari University incorporated Rhodes University's former campuses in East London, giving Fort Hari an urban and coastal base for the first time ever. The behind-the-scenes connection to these two universities can be seen by the fact that both of these universities use symbolism which bear reference to the Roman Catholic Vatican cult-controlled origins. One need only look at the emblems to see the hallmarks of all of this. Anything that takes the shape of a shield is a reference to the Papal Knights and denotes their immediate influence and control. Fort Hari did serve as a missionary school before becoming a university, so it's connected through the church through that. Also notice the rising sun symbolism. The immediate association of Rhodes University with the Papal Knights can be seen by the knight's helmet resting against the knight's shield in the Rhodes University symbolic logo. Also, a common denotation of the Roman Catholic control over a particular educational institution is the use of a Latin motto. But the most obvious aspect as to just how Rhodes served the dark agenda under the guise of British imperialism is the Rhodes Memorial on his favourite spot. Just below the memorial is the original wooden bench that Rhodes used to sit in. The memorial was designed by Sir Herbert Baker. It is made out of granite quarried from Table Mountain and closely resembles the great altar of the Pergamon, which is on display at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. According to Wikipedia, it was this altar, which is dedicated to Zeus, that John of Patmos referred to as Satan's throne. This is taken from the biblical book of Revelations. Zeus was the top god in Greek mythology, and Zeus was renamed as Jupiter when the Romans conquered Greece, and was thus worshipped as such by the Romans. The icon of Jupiter in Rome became the icon of Saint Peter when pagan pantheism turned into pagan monotheism in the form of Roman Catholicism. But Saint Peter is what became of Jupiter and Zeus. How very fitting that this memorial is strikingly similar to the structure that is known as Satan's throne in the Bible, considering that Rhodes used to spend time sitting in the wooden bench just below the memorial, looking out at the British-controlled Cape Town, as if he was sitting in his throne, looking over his lands and empire. In the name of British imperialism, Rhodes had built himself an empire on the back of Africans. Rhodes has been portrayed by Dr. C. McBailey as a violent and brutal racist who used forced labor tactics as a means of founding De Beers and other portions of his lucrative business. When Rhodes died in 1902, De Beers controlled 90% of the world's diamond production. Today, diamonds fund war. Time to learn some of the facts of the people we praise as national heroes.